Tonight, my sister hosted a pastel-themed sugar soirée to livestream her new dream home. She did not know the deed, and the $860,000 defaulted mortgage were in my name. I skipped the registry. Instead, I brought pink macarons hiding court orders and fraud files. By the time our parents finally understand, their own retirement cabin will sink right alongside her fraudulent sugar palace. My name is Avery Lewis. I am 33 years old, and I make my living hunting liars. As a senior financial fraud investigator at Blackridge Integrity Analytics, my daily routine involves tracing phantom LLCs, unraveling shell corporations, and catching white-collar criminals who think they are smarter than the digital footprints they leave behind. Because of the extreme sensitivity of my security clearance and the nature of the data I handle, my own financial background has to be bulletproof. My credit score was a pristine 815. I carried zero debt outside of my modest student loans, paid my credit cards in full every month, and monitored my identity with the kind of paranoia that only comes from knowing exactly how easy it is to ruin a life with a stolen social security number. That is why, when two things arrived at the exact same moment on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the air in my lungs simply vanished. The first was a heavy, certified letter from a major national bank. The second was an urgent flashing notification on my phone from my premium credit monitoring service. I opened the physical letter first. The bold, capitalized letters at the top of the page screamed, "Notice of default and intent to foreclose." My eyes scanned the text, struggling to process the words. It stated that I was 90 days delinquent on a mortgage. The principal balance listed was $860,000. My phone buzzed again in my hand. I unlocked the screen. The monitoring app showed a catastrophic drop in my credit score. It had plummeted by nearly 200 points. Red arrows pointed downward, accompanied by urgent warnings about missed payments and high risk of identity theft. For a fraction of a second, the human part of my brain tried to rationalize it. A clerical error, a system glitch at the credit bureaus. It happens, but the cold, analytical investigator inside me knew better. Errors do not generate certified letters of default for nearly $1 million. I sprinted to my home office, booted up my personal secure terminal, and bypassed the standard consumer credit apps to pull my full, raw, tri-merge credit report directly from the bureaus. The screen loaded, and the devastation was absolute. There were 6 hard inquiries over the past 8 months, all from premium mortgage lenders and high-end retail credit lines. Under the account section, a massive 30-year fixed-rate mortgage sat like a parasite on my file. It had been opened 6 months ago. The first few payments had apparently been made, just enough to get the keys and settle in, before the account went dark. 30 days late, 60 days late, 90 days late, default. The delinquency was destroying my financial reputation, the very foundation of my career at Blackridge. I forced my eyes away from the red flags and focused on the property address attached to the loan. It was located in a luxury, gated community nestled right against the shores of Lake Norman in North Carolina. I read the street name and the house number. I read them again. A strange, icy prickle started at the base of my neck. The address was not a random drop house used by an overseas syndicate. It was not an empty lot. It was deeply, sickeningly familiar. I grabbed my phone again, ignoring the screaming credit alerts, and opened my text message history. I scrolled past work updates and automated reminders until I reached a group chat I had muted weeks ago. The chat was dominated by one person, my older sister, Marissa Cole, 3 weeks prior. Marissa had sent out a lavish, digitally animated invitation that exploded with pastel confetti on the screen. It was an invitation to what she was calling her Sugar Soirée housewarming. The event promised to be a spectacular, influencer-studded affair. She had boasted about a 20-foot candy bar, custom French pastries, a champagne tower, and a live-streamed charity auction to show off her new, perfectly curated life. Marissa and her husband, Gavin, had been bragging for months about closing on their dream home, a massive waterfront estate. I clicked on the digital invitation, bringing up the event details. I stared at the location. The house number, the street name, the zip code in North Carolina. I looked back at the bank's notice of default on my desk. They matched perfectly. Every single letter, every single number. The room spun. The oxygen felt thick and entirely unbreathable. This was not a sophisticated Russian hacking ring. This was not a dark web data broker selling my information to a stranger. The criminals who had stolen my identity, forged my signature, faked my income, and strapped an $860,000 anchor to my neck were not strangers at all. They shared my blood. My sister and her smooth-talking husband were currently living in a waterfront mansion that they had fraudulently purchased under my name. The betrayal was so profound, so audaciously cruel, that my first instinct was primitive. I wanted to grab my keys, drive the 4 hours to Lake Norman, kick down her custom mahogany front door, and scream until my vocal cords bled. I wanted to call our parents and demand to know how this could happen. I wanted to dial 911 and have Marissa and Gavin dragged out of their pastel-themed paradise in handcuffs. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over Marissa's contact icon. Then I stopped. The seasoned investigator inside me, the woman who took down corporate embezzlers and organized fraud rings, seized control. Emotion is the enemy of evidence. Confrontation without preparation is just noise. If I called her now, she would lie. Gavin, who worked in high-end real estate financing, would spin a web of technical jargon. They would destroy evidence. They would hide assets. They would play the victims, and my parents would inevitably rush to shield Marissa, just as they had done our entire lives. I put the phone down. The shaking in my hands ceased, replaced by a terrifying absolute stillness. I opened a new, encrypted folder on my hard drive. I named it Lake Norman Incident. I began taking high-resolution screenshots of my credit report, capturing every fraudulent inquiry, every missed payment, every fabricated address. I exported the raw data files. I scanned the notice of default, ensuring the resolution captured the microprinting on the bank's letterhead. I downloaded Marissa's digital invitation, saving the HTML source code and the exact metadata of the file. I even went to her social media pages and screen-recorded her recent videos touring the unfinished property, capturing her voice claiming ownership over walls that were legally and ruinously mine. I established a strict chain of custody for every piece of data, logging the exact time and date of acquisition. Just as I would for a multi-million-dollar corporate client at Blackridge, they thought I would panic. They thought I would react like a sister, full of tears and dramatic accusations. They thought they could use my pristine record, bleed it dry, and leave me with the wreckage because family is supposed to forgive. They were wrong. I would not give them a single warning. I would not tip my hand. The absolute best fraudsters in the world, the ones who pull off the most elaborate cons, always die from their own hubris. They fail because they rely on their victims reacting emotionally rather than analytically. Marissa and Gavin wanted a house in my name. Fine. But they were about to learn exactly what happens when you steal the identity of a woman who makes a living destroying liars. I closed the folder, locked my screen, and began to build my case. Growing up in the Lewis household meant learning an unspoken, ironclad hierarchy long before you learned how to tie your own shoes. Marissa was the sun, and the rest of us were simply terrestrial bodies meant to orbit her warmth. She was the golden child, a title she wore with the effortless entitlement of royalty. When we were kids, she got the master bedroom down the hall because she claimed she needed the larger closet space for her pageant dresses. I was relegated to the cramped guest room near the noisy laundry machines. When she turned 16, a brand new silver sedan appeared in our driveway, complete with a giant red bow on the roof. When I turned 16, my father handed me a laminated bus schedule and a lecture about how building character builds lifelong wealth. It was never born of intentional malice from my parents, Elaine and Martin. It was a blind, suffocating, and thoroughly American brand of adoration. Marissa was pretty, charmingly fragile, and aggressively demanding. I was capable, quiet, and required absolutely zero maintenance. In a middle-class family desperate to project success, the child who does not ask for help is the child who is quickly forgotten, while the child who demands the world gets it handed to them on a platter. I embraced my independence early. I worked full-time through my college years, pulling double shifts at a local diner to pay my tuition, while strictly maintaining a 4.0 grade point average. I knew nobody was coming to rescue me if I failed. Marissa, conversely, dropped out of her university after barely 3 semesters. She claimed the rigorous academic schedule interfered with her networking. Networking, in her specific vocabulary, meant cultivating a digital aesthetic. Her social media feeds became an endless curated scroll of champagne brunches, designer handbags, and luxury vacations she could not afford. She lived entirely on the surface, trading on her looks and demanding that the world, and our parents, subsidize her manufactured reality. Then came Gavin Cole. If Marissa was the illusion of generational wealth, Gavin was the architect hired to build the facade. He worked in high-end real estate lending, specifically dealing with jumbo mortgages for the newly rich. Gavin was a man constructed entirely of financial buzzwords, perfectly tailored suits that cost more than my entire college tuition, and a blindingly white smile. He spoke in a rapid-fire cadence of yield spreads, equity leverage, and amortization schedules. He was the kind of man who always made a theatrical show of picking up the check at family dinners, ensuring everyone at the table saw the heavy metal credit card he dropped onto the leather folio. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on. To Elaine and Martin, Gavin was the ultimate prize. He was the successful, smooth-talking savior who guaranteed their golden child would never have to touch the harsh, grinding reality of a working-class life. They constantly referred to him as the pride of our family, the man who finally gave Marissa the beautiful life she inherently deserved. But I spent my days dissecting financial criminals, and I saw right through his polished veneer. 2 years ago, the cracks in their gilded existence started showing, at least to anyone who knew where to look. Gavin was driving a leased European sports car, yet I noticed his premium credit cards were frequently declined at restaurants, and he was constantly making frantic phone calls about shifting money between obscure accounts. That was when my mother called me to ask for what she termed a tiny family favor. I remember sitting at my kitchen island, holding the phone slightly away from my ear as she pitched the idea. She told me Gavin was experiencing a temporary liquidity issue because his massive commissions were tied up in a complicated escrow process. She asked if I would simply co-sign a short-term, high-yield bridge loan for them. She insisted that because my credit history was so exceptionally strong, my signature would be a mere formality. I refused flat out. I did not sugarcoat it. I told my mother exactly what I saw, that Gavin was living astronomically beyond his actual income, that he was playing a dangerous shell game with his finances, and that tying my pristine professional identity to his sinking ship was absolute suicide for an investigator in my line of work. The silence on the other end of the phone was heavy and suffocating. Then, the emotional manipulation began. My father took the receiver from my mother. His voice was laced with a cold disappointment I had never heard directed at my sister. He told me I was acting completely heartless. He said I was selfish, that I lacked the fundamental loyalty that holds a real family together. He outright accused me of being bitterly jealous of Marissa's success and Gavin's ambition. From that day forward, an invisible but impenetrable wall went up. I was no longer just the fiercely independent daughter. I was the ungrateful, cynical one who refused to sacrifice for her own blood. The family dynamic shifted permanently. My parents closed ranks tightly around Marissa and Gavin, leaving me entirely frozen out. Sitting in my home office now, staring at the encrypted files detailing my stolen identity, I pieced the puzzle together. How did Gavin actually do it? To push an $860,000 owner-occupied mortgage through a stringent underwriting process, you need far more than just a stolen Social Security number. You need years of W-2 forms. You need comprehensive tax returns. You need intimate historical data to answer the highly specific security questions that banks pull from obscure public records. Where did a luxury mortgage broker get that level of granular, deeply personal detail on his estranged sister-in-law? The realization hit me with the sheer force of a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. 5 years ago, I moved from a spacious apartment into a much smaller, highly secure flat closer to my downtown office. I simply did not have the square footage for everything, so I left 3 heavy-duty cardboard banker boxes in the dusty corner of the attic at my parents' house. Those boxes contained my old tax returns from my early 20s, expired driver's licenses, thick stacks of bank statements from long-closed accounts, and an old, bulky laptop I had used extensively during my college years. I had fully intended to rent a commercial shredder and destroy it all, but my career accelerated. Life got insanely busy, and I made the fatal assumption that my sensitive documents were perfectly safe under my parents' roof. My parents' house, the exact house where Gavin was welcomed with open arms every single Sunday for dinner, the house where he was trusted with the master alarm code, the house where Elaine and Martin would have gladly pointed him toward the attic stairs if he casually claimed he was looking for some old family photo albums to digitize for Marissa's upcoming birthday. He had unlimited, entirely unsupervised access to the raw, foundational materials of my financial existence. He did not just steal my identity out of the digital ether. He did not buy it from a dark web broker. He harvested it directly from the attic of my childhood home. Undoubtedly, while my parents sat downstairs drinking the expensive wine he brought them, a creeping, icy sensation crawled up my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. The question of who committed this fraud was utterly and painfully resolved. The question of why was glaringly obvious. They needed money, and I was the perfect, oblivious host to parasite off of. Now, staring at the intricate, devastating web of fraudulent approvals and fabricated documents glowing on my monitor, a much darker, far more dangerous question took root in my mind. I no longer wondered who betrayed me. I wondered just how sophisticatedly they had built this financial bomb, and exactly how many people I was going to have to legally destroy in order to dismantle it. I locked the heavy oak door of my home office and engaged the deadbolt. The time for reeling from the shock had passed, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused clarity that I usually reserved for dismantling offshore embezzlement rings. I bypassed the consumer-grade applications on my terminal and established a secure, encrypted tunnel directly into the primary data repositories. I did not just want to see the damage. I needed to dissect the architecture of the crime. I pulled the comprehensive, unredacted mortgage origination file and the deep-tier account histories. The first glaring anomaly hit me like a physical strike. In the primary loan classification field, the underwriters had stamped the file as an owner-occupied mortgage. In the realm of real estate finance, declaring that you intend to live in the property is the golden key. It unlocks significantly lower interest rates and requires a fraction of the down payment compared to an investment property. The legal ramifications, however, are massive. Since I had never set foot on that property, never spent a single night breathing the air inside those walls, this was no longer a simple case of identity theft. It had instantly escalated to occupancy fraud, a severe federal offense. The stakes had just multiplied exponentially. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, accessing the county recorder's digital archives. I needed to see the public footprint. I pulled the master deed for the Lake Norman estate. There it was, my full legal name etched in black and white as the sole, undisputed owner of the property. But as my eyes scanned the secondary contact fields, a sharp, bitter realization washed over me. The primary mailing address listed for tax assessments and official correspondence was not my secure downtown apartment. It was the residential address of my parents' house. The mechanical precision of the fraud was becoming horrifyingly clear. A bank does not simply foreclose overnight. They send escalating warnings, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, default notices, intents to accelerate the loan. A massive paper trail of disaster had been generated over the last few months, and every single piece of it had been systematically rerouted. Whoever orchestrated this had utilized my parents' mailbox as a physical firewall. The letters were intercepted and hidden away before they could ever reach me. This was a calculated, ongoing campaign of mail interception. I refused to sit in the dark and be a victim. I opened a fresh, secure window on my secondary monitor and immediately filed a sworn comprehensive identity theft affidavit with the Federal Trade Commission. Next, I executed an extended 7-year fraud alert across all 3 major credit bureaus, effectively slamming down a steel door on any new lines of credit being opened in my name. Then, I drafted a highly aggressive, legally binding preservation request. I transmitted it directly to the lender's legal department, demanding they immediately lock down all origination files, IP address logs, audio recordings of verification calls, and internal underwriter notes related to the transaction. I explicitly mandated that absolutely nothing be deleted, altered, or archived. A standard victim would have rushed down to the local police precinct, clutching printed papers and demanding justice. I knew the system too well to make that amateur mistake. If I walked into a local station and explained that my sister and her husband bought a luxury house using my name, a fatigued desk sergeant would instantly categorize it as a civil dispute. They would label it a messy family misunderstanding, hand me a generic incident report, and tell me to hire a civil attorney. I needed surgical, devastating strikes. I bypassed local law enforcement entirely. I packaged my preliminary findings into a dense forensic dossier and routed it directly to the lender's internal fraud unit and the title insurer's Special Investigations Division. Corporate investigators do not care about bloodlines or family drama. They care about mitigating massive financial liability. I was weaponizing their corporate panic against my own flesh and blood. On my ultra-wide center monitor, I launched the digital link analysis software we utilized for complex corporate syndicates at Blackridge. I began to construct a sprawling case map. I plotted the timeline, dragging a node from the year I left my personal archives in that attic, all the way to the precise date the fraudulent mortgage was funded. I mapped the data sources, color-coding the access points. The web of connections all pointed to one centralized node, Gavin. He possessed the unchecked physical proximity to my old tax documents, the access to the diverted mail at the house, and the highly specialized industry knowledge required to navigate a high-yield loan through a stringent underwriting labyrinth. But as I meticulously reviewed the income verification section of the origination file, my hand froze on the mouse. A jarring, impossible anomaly stared back at me from the high-resolution screen. To secure an approval for a loan of $860,000, the borrower requires a formidable debt-to-income ratio. My legitimate, verified salary at the firm was excellent, but it was mathematically insufficient to unilaterally carry that massive debt load without a highly qualified co-borrower. Yet, the automated underwriting system showed I had cleared the financial threshold with room to spare. I scrolled down to the employer verification attachments. Below the entry for my actual corporate employer, a second, entirely distinct stream of revenue had been injected into the file. The documentation claimed I was receiving a massive, recurring monthly retainer from a corporate entity named Blue Harbor Transit Consulting. I stared at the name. I had never heard of Blue Harbor Transit Consulting in my entire life. I had never signed a consulting contract, never rendered services, and never received a single penny from them. The air in the room grew ice cold. Gavin had not merely pilfered my historical data to squeak by. He had actively, aggressively manufactured a phantom income stream. He had fabricated a fake corporate entity, generated fraudulent pay stubs out of thin air, and likely falsified secondary bank deposit records to trick the automated verification systems. This was not a crime of desperate opportunity using stolen papers. It was a highly sophisticated, multi-layered financial forgery designed by a professional who knew exactly how the system worked. He had built an elaborate, incredibly dangerous financial trap, completely oblivious to the fact that he had built it around a woman whose entire professional existence was dedicated to burning people like him to the ground. The morning sun had barely crested the skyline when my secure company phone buzzed. It was exactly 7:30 in the morning. The caller ID displayed the internal extension for the Office of Professional Responsibility and Compliance at Blackridge Integrity Analytics. In my line of work, that specific extension never calls to deliver good news. An hour later, I sat in a sterile, glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor. Across the polished mahogany table sat the head of internal risk management and a senior human resources director. The atmosphere was completely devoid of the usual corporate pleasantries. At Blackridge, our product was trust. We audited multi-billion-dollar corporations, hunted down international asset bleed, and verified the absolute integrity of financial ecosystems. To do that, every single investigator in the building was subjected to continuous automated evaluation. Our personal finances were monitored by the same algorithms we use to hunt criminals. The risk director, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a grimace, slid a single, stapled document across the table. I did not need to read it. I knew exactly what the algorithm had caught during its nightly sweep. The massive default status, the sudden, catastrophic drop in my credit rating, the newly minted, severely delinquent mortgage. He explained the protocol in a voice completely stripped of empathy. I was not being terminated today, but my security clearance was being instantly suspended. I was officially placed on administrative hold. Effective immediately, my access to all proprietary databases, client files, and sensitive investigative tools was revoked. I was effectively grounded, isolated from the very instruments I used to make a living. They were giving me exactly 14 days to produce irrefutable, independently verifiable proof that I was the victim of a sophisticated identity theft operation. If I failed to clear the derogatory marks within that 2-week window, my employment would be terminated with cause, and my professional reputation in the financial intelligence community would be permanently incinerated. The humiliation burned hot in my chest. I was the apex predator in this building, the person they called when an executive was suspected of cooking the books. Now, I was sitting in the suspect chair, stripped of my badge, fighting to prove I was not a reckless, defaulting debtor. As I packed up my desk under the watchful eye of a security escort, my former mentor and the current managing director of my division walked into my cubicle. His name was Robert. He had recruited me straight out of graduate school, recognizing the cold, analytical detachment that made me a natural investigator. He leaned against the partition, his eyes scanning the empty cardboard box I was filling with personal items. He spoke quietly, ensuring the security escort could not hear. He told me he knew I did not do this. He had watched me manage my life with absolute precision for years, but he also delivered the harshest, most necessary piece of advice I would receive. He explicitly warned me against fighting this with emotion. He said the compliance committee did not care about family betrayal. They did not care about tears, and they certainly did not care about my personal history with the people who set me up. They only respected one language: data. He told me to return with a meticulously documented, unassailable chain of evidence. If I brought them a story, I would lose my job. If I brought them a forensic masterpiece, I would survive. I handed over my company-issued encrypted laptop and my biometric access card. I walked out of the glass doors and took the elevator down to the street level, a civilian for the first time in nearly a decade. The clock was now actively ticking. 14 days. 336 hours to dismantle a crime that had taken months to meticulously construct. I returned to my apartment and immediately locked the door. I walked past the kitchen and headed straight for my secondary workstation. While I was prohibited from using Blackridge's proprietary, multi-million-dollar software suites, I was still a highly trained open-source intelligence analyst. My personal rig was custom-built for deep web scraping, public records aggregation, and massive data synthesis. It was entirely legal, completely isolated from my employer's network, and fully capable of prosecuting this war. I sat in my ergonomic chair and laid down the absolute rules of engagement. I would not utilize a single favor from my colleagues. I would not ask anyone inside the firm to run a quiet background check. Every single piece of intelligence I gathered had to be meticulously sourced from the public domain, legally obtained through standard channels, or voluntarily provided by the reporting agencies. If I tainted the investigation by using unauthorized corporate assets, Gavin's high-priced defense attorneys would easily dismiss my findings as the obsessive, illegal stalking of a disgruntled sister. My hands had to remain immaculately clean while I dug into the absolute filth they had created. I booted up my monitors and opened a massive digital whiteboard application. I divided the vast, blank canvas into 3 distinct, parallel investigative tracks. Track 1 was the localized breach. I needed to map the exact trajectory of the fraudulent mortgage from origination to default. This meant identifying the specific loan officer, analyzing the notary seals on the closing documents, and tracing the IP addresses used to submit the initial application. I needed to prove that my physical location and digital footprint at the time of signing completely contradicted the location of the forged closing. Track 2 was the phantom revenue stream. The fabricated corporate entity used to inflate my income was the fatal flaw in Gavin's design. Constructing a fake company requires filing state registration documents, paying incorporation fees, and establishing a digital presence. Someone had to pay those fees. Someone had to register that domain name. I was going to follow the digital breadcrumbs of that fake consulting firm until I found the exact credit card or bank account used to birth it into existence. Track 3 was the hardest to stomach, but the most crucial for establishing the timeline of the conspiracy, the facilitators. I had to investigate my own parents. I needed to document exactly when my mail was diverted, who authorized the address change with the Postal Service, and how long they had been actively concealing the escalating collection notices. Their passive complicity was the shield Gavin relied upon. I was going to shatter that shield. I stared at the 3 columns. A profound shift occurred within me during those quiet hours in my apartment. The initial shock and the burning desire for immediate, petty retaliation evaporated. Getting my name simply removed from the loan was no longer the objective. Salvaging my job at Blackridge was merely a secondary benefit. If I merely disputed the debt, the bank might eventually write it off. The credit bureaus would slowly heal my score, and my family would quietly sweep the entire ordeal under the rug as a massive misunderstanding. They would continue their polished, wealthy charade, whispering behind my back about how dramatic I had been. I was not going to allow that. I was not building a defense. I was architecting a prosecution. I was going to construct a dossier so devastatingly complete, so legally terrifying, that when I finally unveiled it, multiple federal and state regulatory agencies would have no choice but to act. I was going to burn the entire fraudulent empire to the ground, and I was going to make absolutely certain that everyone involved understood precisely who struck the match. I pulled into the pristine, freshly paved driveway of the colonial house where I grew up. The manicured lawn looked aggressively green, and the blooming azalea bushes framed the front porch perfectly. It was the absolute picture of upper-middle-class American stability. I walked straight through the unlocked front door, breathing in the familiar scent of vanilla potpourri and furniture polish. The hallway was lined with framed photographs, nearly all of them featuring Marissa's various milestones. I found Elaine and Martin sitting comfortably in the sunroom, sharing a plate of sliced fruit and reading the Sunday paper. I did not offer a greeting. I walked over to the glass coffee table and tossed the thick, certified envelope from the National Bank directly onto Elaine's crossword puzzle. I asked them, keeping my voice remarkably even, if they knew exactly who was currently living at the Lake Norman estate. I stood there waiting for the inevitable shock. I braced myself for my mother to gasp, for my father to demand an explanation, for the typical panic of innocent people confronting a massive financial crime. Instead, Elaine merely sighed, a sound of profound annoyance, and carefully set her reading glasses on the table. She looked up at me with an expression of mild exhaustion. "Avery, please do not start with the dramatics," she said smoothly. "They only borrowed your credit profile temporarily. It is just a placeholder. Gavin is going to refinance the entire property back into his own name next year when the commercial interest rates drop." The room seemed to physically tilt on its axis. Borrowed. She said the word borrowed as if we were discussing a cashmere sweater or a piece of luggage, not a legally binding federal document carrying a debt of nearly $1 million. I turned my gaze to my father, my knuckles turning white as I clenched my fists at my sides. How did he get my data? My full social security number, my employment history, my old tax returns? Martin crossed his arms defensively over his chest, his jaw setting into a stubborn line. Gavin mentioned he needed to borrow some old financial papers to complete a practice profile for a new wealth management certification he was taking. You left all those banker boxes in our attic collecting dust for years. He is family. Avery. I let him take a look through them. It was harmless research. Harmless research, I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I stepped closer to the table. And the mail? The foreclosure warnings from the bank? The letters of default that have been arriving at this house for the past 3 months? Elaine calmly opened the small oak drawer of the end table beside her chair. She pulled out a thick stack of unopened envelopes, all bearing the stark red logos of the mortgage lender, and dropped them onto the glass. We held on to them, she explained, her tone entirely justified and devoid of guilt. We knew perfectly well that if we forwarded these notices to your apartment, you would just make a massive, dramatic deal out of nothing. You always blow things out of proportion. Gavin assured us he was handling the late payments quietly, and we did not want you ruining Marissa's mood while she was decorating. I looked at the stack of hidden mail, the physical proof of their active complicity. I told them flatly that Gavin was not handling anything. I explained that the loan was in total default, that the property was entering active foreclosure, and that they needed to pick up the phone and call Marissa right this second. I demanded they list that waterfront house for sale by tomorrow morning to liquidate the asset and clear my stolen name from the fraudulent debt. Absolutely not, my mother snapped, sitting up straight, genuinely offended by the suggestion. Marissa is building her brand right now. She has 3 major corporate sponsors secured for the housewarming party next week. If she puts that house on the market today, she will lose all her influencer contracts and look like a total failure to her followers. You cannot seriously ask her to lose face publicly just because you are panicking over some banking paperwork. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, trying to bridge the staggering gap between reality and her delusions. I am going to the federal authorities, I stated simply, laying out the undeniable consequence. I will report this as a massive identity theft, and Gavin will go to federal prison for wire fraud. Martin stood up abruptly, his face hardening into an ugly scowl. We figured you would threaten something vindictive like that. You never could stand seeing your sister happy. That is exactly why we had to take precautions. My stomach plummeted into an icy abyss. What precautions? We went to the bank yesterday and withdrew the savings fund your grandfather left you, Martin said, his voice completely steady. We used it to put a retainer down for a top-tier defense attorney for Gavin, just in case you actually tried to sue him and ruin your sister's marriage. The air vanished from the room. The college fund my grandfather had set aside, the $75,000 I had left untouched in a joint family account for a decade, saving it for a down payment on my own modest home. It was gone, liquidated. They had stolen my inheritance to fund the legal defense of the very man who stole my identity. They robbed my future to protect his crime. You stole my money to protect a felon? I asked, my voice dropping to a hollow rasp. It is family money, Elaine corrected sharply, waving her hand dismissively, and we had to do something to protect our son-in-law. Besides, Gavin promised to pay it all back with interest once his big commercial real estate deal closes. He even had us sign some temporary financial support papers just to prove he is good for the money. See? He is a perfectly legitimate professional. She reached into her large floral tote bag, resting on the floor, and pulled out a folded packet of legal documents, waving it at me like a flag of peace. My trained eyes instantly locked onto the dense, boilerplate legal text visible on the front page. I snatched the packet from her hand before she could pull it away. I scanned the header of the first page. It was not a promissory note. It was not a receipt for the stolen funds. The bold black letters read, Cross-Collateralization and Liquidity Guarantee Agreement. I rapidly read the terms of the contract. My parents had blindly pledged their own unencumbered assets as a collateral backstop for Gavin's hidden bridge loans. Specifically, They had signed away the deed to their mountain retirement cabin, tying it directly to his volatile, failing financial portfolio. They had signed away their own hard-earned financial security to a con artist simply because he smiled, wore a tailored suit, and made their favorite daughter happy. I pulled my phone from my pocket and quickly photographed every single page of the agreement, the shutter clicking loudly in the quiet sunroom. "Give that back right now," Martin demanded, taking a threatening step forward. I handed the papers back to my mother, letting them fall onto her lap. The furious, screaming argument I had anticipated having on the drive over never materialized. There was no longer anything to scream about. The burning grief and the desperate need for their validation had burned off entirely, leaving nothing behind but a vast, terrifyingly icy void. I felt the tether snap. The invisible biological string that had connected me to these two people for 3 decades broke cleanly, quietly, and permanently. They did not see a daughter standing in front of them. They saw a resource. They saw a shield. They saw a sacrificial lamb entirely willing to be slaughtered on the altar of Marissa's aesthetic perfection. "Do not call me again," I said. My voice was barely above a whisper, yet the absolute finality in it cut through the room like a razor blade. "Avery, be reasonable," Elaine called out, a hint of genuine annoyance returning to her tone as I turned my back to them. "It is just money. We are a family." I walked out the front door, leaving it wide open to the afternoon breeze. I did not shed a single tear as I walked down the driveway. I did not look back at the manicured lawn or the house where I grew up. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away. The defensive phase of this nightmare was officially over. I was no longer trying to protect myself, and I was no longer hoping to salvage a relationship that never truly existed. The gloves were off. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire world, legally and financially, until there was nothing left but the brutal, undeniable price of their betrayal. The burning anger that had propelled me out of my parents' house evaporated the moment I locked my apartment door behind me. I was no longer a betrayed daughter. I was an operative back in her element, and the target had just expanded. I sat down at my workstation, the glow of the 3 massive monitors illuminating the dark room. I pulled up the corporate registry database for the state and typed in the name of the phantom company that had miraculously qualified me for an $860,000 mortgage: Blue Harbor Transit Consulting. The search results loaded instantly. Blue Harbor was a limited liability company, but it was practically an infant. The articles of organization had been filed exactly 5 weeks before my forged mortgage application was submitted. I pulled the registration documents and checked the physical address. It was not a corporate plaza or a downtown high-rise. It was a commercial mail receiving agency located in a rundown strip mall 2 states over. A glorified post office box. There was no website, no state tax footprint, no active business license. It was a ghost ship, but every ghost ship has a captain. I scrolled down to the registered agent section of the filing. The name listed was Marcus Vance. I opened a new tab and ran a deep web sweep on the name, cross-referencing it with Gavin's professional network. Within 4 minutes, the puzzle piece snapped violently into place. Marcus Vance was not a transit consultant. He was a 24-year-old junior loan processor working directly under Gavin at his luxury real estate brokerage. The internal leak was entirely exposed. Gavin had not acted alone. He had recruited his own subordinate to build the financial fiction. I dove back into the forged income verification file, viewing it now through the lens of an inside job. It was a masterclass in data manipulation. Marcus had not just typed in a fake salary, he had seeded my stolen profile with a meticulously fabricated secondary income stream. There were fraudulent consulting contracts bearing forged signatures. There were altered bank statements showing a beautifully consistent history of direct deposits from Blue Harbor, perfectly timed to land on the 15th of every month. The transfers were designed to look impeccably clean, specifically tailored to sail right past the automated risk assessment algorithms used by national underwriters. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Something was still missing. The mechanics of the fraud were clear, but the cash flow did not make sense. I picked up my tablet and navigated to Marissa's public social media profiles. I scrolled back through her endless grid of curated perfection until I found a specific video. It was a high-production vlog titled Demo Day at the Dream Estate. In the video, Marissa was wearing a hard hat over her perfectly styled hair, swinging a sledgehammer into a massive kitchen island, while a crew of private contractors cheered her on in the background. The kitchen was entirely gutted. Custom Italian marble slabs were leaning against the exposed drywall, waiting to be installed. I checked the metadata and the upload date on the post. Then, I looked over at the official closing documents for the mortgage on my main screen. The room went entirely silent as the implication hit me. Marissa posted the demolition and renovation video exactly 28 days before the official closing date of the mortgage. She was tearing down walls and receiving deliveries of imported marble nearly a month before the bank actually funded the loan and released the money. High-end contractors do not work on credit, and they certainly do not order custom imported materials without a massive upfront deposit. They usually demand 50% down before a single hammer swings. Where did Gavin get $50,000 or more in liquid cash to pay construction crews a month before the loan even existed? He was kiting. Gavin was running a sophisticated real estate float. He was likely siphoning temporary funds from other clients' escrow accounts, or pulling unauthorized advances from different active deals in his pipeline. Using that stolen liquidity to fund Marissa's renovations, and then planning to quietly replace the stolen funds once my fraudulent mortgage finally closed and paid out. He was spinning plates, robbing one account to cover another. If he was doing it for this house, there was a high statistical probability he had done it before. I widened my search parameters. I accessed the county recorder's database and pulled every single property deed and mortgage origination tied to Gavin's specific broker license over the past 18 months. I did not need to uncover a massive billion-dollar criminal empire. In financial investigations, you just need to prove a deliberate, repeating pattern to escalate a case from a localized fraud dispute to a federal racketeering investigation. I spent the next 3 hours filtering through dozens of transactions. Most were perfectly clean, but then I found them. 3 distinct luxury property transactions scattered across 2 different counties. I pulled the public records for all 3. They shared a terrifying symmetry. All 3 buyers possessed suspiciously pristine credit profiles, coupled with massive, sudden spikes in secondary income right before approval. When I checked the corporate addresses listed for those secondary employers, 2 of them traced back to the exact same strip mall post office box used by Blue Harbor. But the most damning piece of the pattern was the notary public. Every legal real estate closing requires a licensed notary to verify the identity of the person signing the documents. The same notary stamp appeared on my forged deed and on the 3 suspicious files I had just flagged. I zoomed in on the circular seal stamped on my fraudulent contract. The notary was a real, actively licensed official in the state. However, printed faintly beneath the physical seal was a digital tracking code indicating it was a remote online notarization. During the pandemic, the state legalized remote notarizations. A borrower no longer had to sit in a room with a notary. They could sign digital documents over a secure video call. But to do so, the borrower had to hold their physical driver's license up to the webcam and answer live. Dynamic security questions generated by a third-party verification service. How did Gavin get a notary to verify my face on a live video feed when I was sitting in my corporate office 300 miles away? He either used deepfake software to map my photos onto a hired actor, or, much more likely, the notary was entirely in on the scam. They had bypassed the video verification protocol altogether, rubber stamping the digital signatures while logging a fake video session. I stood up and walked over to the massive digital whiteboard dominating the far wall of my office. I picked up a stylus and began drawing the map. This was no longer a case of a desperate brother-in-law making a terrible mistake. It was a structured syndicate. I drew a circle at the top and wrote Gavin's name. He was the architect and the primary coordinator. I drew a line down to Marcus Vance. He was the data fabricator, the internal mechanism that bypassed the banking firewalls. I drew a line across to the corrupt notary public, the legal validator who gave the forged documents their final lethal authority. Then, I drew a line to Marissa. She was not an innocent, oblivious wife. She was the primary beneficiary, and her social media empire was the laundering mechanism, converting illicitly obtained real estate into corporate sponsorships and public prestige. Finally, I drew a line at the very bottom, creating a foundational base for the entire structure. I wrote down the names of my parents. They were the physical firewall. They were the enablers who provided the raw materials for the identity theft and systematically intercepted the warning flares that would have exposed the operation months ago. I stepped back and looked at the completed board. The sheer scale of the betrayal was breathtaking, but the forensic beauty of the evidence was undeniable. Every single person on that board had a specific, prosecutable role. They had built a house of cards on top of my name, assuming I would just quietly absorb the weight. They had no idea that I had just mapped every single structural weakness, and I was about to pull the bottom card. I spent the next 48 hours transforming my digital whiteboard into 4 highly weaponized, legally binding dossiers. I did not waste time drafting angry emails or making threatening phone calls. I operated purely in the realm of procedure. Revenge executed through proper administrative channels is infinitely more devastating than any physical confrontation, because it utilizes the crushing weight of the system itself. I dispatched the first package directly to the internal fraud unit of the mortgage lender. The second went to the special investigations unit of the title insurance underwriter. The third was routed to the State Department of Financial Regulation, specifically targeting the licensing board that allowed Gavin to operate as a broker. The final package, detailing the intercepted default notices at my parents' house, was sent to the United States Postal Inspection Service. Mail theft is a federal offense, and postal inspectors do not care about family misunderstandings. To execute the ground war, I retained a senior litigation partner at Lawson Pike Legal, a corporate law firm renowned for acting as absolute predators in complex real estate disputes. We sat in his corner office for 2 hours, mapping out the offensive strategy. Our first maneuver was to file an ex parte temporary injunction in county court, officially slapping a lis pendens on the property title. This was the ultimate lockdown, with a formal notice of pending litigation attached to the deed. The house was entirely frozen. Gavin could not sell it. He could not refinance it to hide the stolen funds, and he could not execute a quick quitclaim deed to transfer ownership to one of his phantom corporate entities. The asset was trapped in my name until I decided to release it. As my attorney drafted the aggressive filings, he suggested we loop in the State Family Services Division, noting that the impending criminal indictments would create an unstable environment for a child. I immediately raised my hand and drew an absolute, non-negotiable boundary. Marissa was 6 months pregnant. I explicitly instructed my legal counsel that absolutely none of our tactics were to target her medical well-being, the pregnancy, or the unborn child. We were conducting a surgical strike on financial fraud. I refused to let this devolve into a scorched earth campaign that caused collateral biological harm. The consequences were reserved strictly for the adults who had engineered the crime. With the asset frozen, I turned my attention to the impending housewarming party. A lesser person might have driven to the property and illegally shut off the water valve or snipped the fiber optic internet cables. That kind of petty vandalism was beneath me, and it was too easily repaired. I wanted to dismantle the very foundation of her event using nothing but bureaucracy. Marissa was heavily promoting her pastel-themed gathering as a sponsored livestream, expecting thousands of viewers. When you host a commercial event on private residential property, local ordinances require a temporary commercial liability insurance policy. My attorney sent a formal, perfectly polite notice of dispute to the primary underwriter of Marissa's event insurance, attaching a certified copy of the court injunction and the active federal fraud investigations connected to the property. Insurance actuaries are the most risk-averse creatures on the planet. The moment they saw a contested title and an active identity theft probe, they instantly triggered a cancellation clause. Marissa's event liability coverage was suspended immediately. The domino effect was spectacular and entirely predictable. high-end event vendors do not operate on a handshake, especially when the liability shield vanishes. The luxury catering company, the custom lighting crew, and the artisanal pastry chefs all received automated notices that the primary insurance rider had been revoked. Panic rippled through their ranks. They began calling Gavin, demanding that their contracts be rewritten and that their remaining balances be paid in full, up front, using completely cleared funds before they would agree to unload a single delivery truck. Gavin tried to deploy his usual smooth-talking charm, but the structural damage I had inflicted was already catching up to him. The fraud package I had sent to the mortgage lender had triggered an emergency internal review. As a standard precaution, the bank placed a hard freeze on all financial profiles associated with the flagged loan. Gavin's primary credit lines and operating accounts were suddenly declining transactions. He could not wire the funds to the panicked vendors because his digital banking portals were locked down by compliance officers. He was forced into a humiliating scramble. To keep Marissa's dream party from collapsing before the cameras even rolled, he had to physically withdraw small stacks of cash from secondary, unaffected accounts. When that was not enough, he resorted to begging his subordinate employees to use their personal mobile payment apps to pay the florists and the caterers in piecemeal installments, promising to reimburse them next week. He was bleeding out financially, suffocating under the invisible pressure of the legal tourniquet I had applied. Then, the final, most devastating piece of evidence arrived, completely by accident. I was checking the mail at my secure downtown apartment when I found a thick envelope forwarded from a luxury European furniture atelier. It was a past-due collections invoice for $22,500. I opened it, expecting to find another debt Gavin had secretly attached to my stolen credit profile. Instead, I found the holy grail of plausible deniability destruction. The invoice was for a massive, custom-upholstered curved velvet sectional sofa and 2 imported crystal chandeliers. The billing profile was established under the name Avery Lewis, clearly designated as the legal homeowner. But when I looked at the secondary contact fields and the digital signature on the custom order agreement, the breath caught in my throat. The email address listed for delivery updates was Marissa's personal account. The signature authorizing the massive line of store credit was a sloppy forgery of my name, but the handwriting style unmistakably matched my sister's. My parents had desperately tried to convince me that Marissa was simply an innocent bystander, a naive wife who thought her successful husband was just handling the boring paperwork. They wanted me to believe she had no idea the house was legally mine. This piece of paper annihilated that defense. Marissa had deliberately masqueraded as me. She had leveraged my stolen identity, fully utilizing the title of homeowner, to bypass credit checks and secure tens of thousands of dollars in luxury furnishings for her staged reality. She knew exactly whose name was on the deed, and she actively participated in exploiting it. I carefully placed the invoice into a clear plastic evidence sleeve and added it to the master file on my desk. Every single trap was now fully armed. The legal locks were engaged, the financial oxygen was cut off, and the definitive proof of my sister's active malice was secured in my hands. The countdown to the party had begun, and they had absolutely no idea the ground beneath them had already collapsed. The text message arrived exactly at 9 in the morning. Gavin requested a formal sit-down. He called it a family reconciliation summit, hosted at the downtown headquarters of their luxury event planner, specifically inside the private pastry tasting room. He claimed he wanted to clear the air before the big day, so we could all move forward as a united front. I knew exactly what it was. It was a desperate, cornered animal trying to negotiate its way out of a steel trap. I agreed to meet at 2 in the afternoon, but I absolutely did not go alone. My attorney assigned a senior paralegal named Elena to accompany me. In my state, recording a conversation requires the consent of all parties, but having a highly credible third-party professional witness taking contemporaneous, legally admissible notes entirely bypasses the need for hidden microphones. We walked into the boutique bakery precisely on time. The air inside the room was thick with the heavy scent of spun sugar and imported vanilla bean. It was a sickeningly sweet contrast to the absolute financial slaughter I was orchestrating. Gavin was sitting at a white marble high-top table, flanked by tiered displays of pink macarons and miniature eclairs. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit, looking every bit the successful luxury broker, though the deep dark circles under his eyes betrayed the immense, crushing strain of his frozen bank accounts and the panicking event vendors. He gestured to the empty plush chairs, flashing a tight, heavily practiced smile. He launched into his pitch immediately, keeping his voice low and remarkably smooth. He attempted to reframe the massive mortgage fraud as a mere temporary financial structure. He insisted that the loan was a standard industry placeholder, a brilliant bridge strategy to secure the asset while Marissa finalized a massive, multi-year sponsorship deal with a home lifestyle brand. He promised that if I simply called off the dogs, lifted the court injunction, and withdrew my regulatory complaints, he would refinance the entire estate out of my name in exactly 60 days. I sat perfectly still, letting his manipulative words hang in the sugary air. Elena sat silently beside me, her high-quality pen flying across her legal pad. Meticulously documenting every single admission of liability, he dressed up as corporate jargon. I looked him dead in the eye and told him there was zero chance I was withdrawing anything. I stated unequivocally that the loan was a federal crime, and I would see it prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of the law. The polished, professional veneer cracked instantly. Gavin leaned forward, dropping the friendly brother-in-law act. His tone shifted into a calculated, incredibly soft threat. He reminded me that Blackridge Integrity Analytics relied on investigators with flawless professional reputations. He suggested that if this messy, vindictive family drama became public knowledge, he might be forced to defend himself by expressing deep concern for my mental stability. He heavily implied he could easily spin a media narrative that I was suffering from a paranoid psychological breakdown, lashing out at my highly successful sister due to deep-seated, lifelong jealousy. A public narrative like that, he noted with a cold smirk, would make any compliance department revoke a security clearance permanently. It was a classic extortion tactic, designed to make me panic about my career and surrender. Instead, I leaned in and asked him a very specific, highly tactical question. I asked him how a paranoid, unstable sister managed to magically bypass the multi-factor authentication on a state-regulated remote notarization portal. Gavin scoffed, waving his hand dismissively in the air. He said it was not even that complicated. He arrogantly explained that the banking portal sent a one-time verification code to the legacy email address I had left logged in on that old laptop in the attic. When the system required a secondary physical verification pin mailed to the billing address, he simply asked Martin and Elaine to keep an eye out for the specific bank envelope and read him the 6 digits over the phone. My heart beat in a slow, incredibly triumphant rhythm. Elena underlined the sentence twice on her yellow notepad. He had just confessed, directly in front of a professional legal witness, to federal wire fraud, unauthorized access to a secure computer system, and a criminal conspiracy involving my parents. Before he could process the monumental, life-ruining error he had just made, the heavy glass door to the tasting room swung open violently. Marissa burst in, her smartphone held high above her head, the camera light glowing blindingly white. She was live on her primary social media channel, broadcasting directly to her hundreds of thousands of followers. She had clearly choreographed this entire ambush with him. She immediately began crying real tears, angling the camera to capture my completely stoic face while she played the devastated victim. She sobbed to her massive digital audience, claiming her estranged sister was actively trying to ruin her high-risk pregnancy and her dream housewarming over a petty, childhood grudge. She shoved the phone toward my face, demanding I apologize to her followers for trying to cancel her lucrative brand contracts. I did not flinch. I did not hide my face or raise my voice. I looked directly into the camera lens. I stated, clearly and calmly, that this was an active legal matter regarding an $860,000 forged mortgage, and I strongly advised her to speak with her criminal defense attorney before speaking further. Marissa panicked at the total lack of an emotional reaction. She tried to pivot, speaking rapidly to her audience to regain control of the crumbling narrative. In her frantic, desperate attempt to sound innocent, she made a fatal, entirely unscripted error. She yelled at the camera that I was being ridiculous, loudly proclaiming that everyone knew my sister's name was just easier for the underwriting department to process quickly, and it was not a big deal at all. The live chat scrolling on the bottom of her screen seemed to freeze for a fraction of a second before completely exploding. Her eagle-eyed followers, the very audience she relied on for her entire income, instantly caught the massive slip of the tongue. The comments began flooding in like a tidal wave, questioning why her sister's name had to be used for underwriting if Gavin was supposedly a wealthy, independent real estate mogul. They asked if she just blatantly admitted to mortgage fraud on a live public broadcast, realizing exactly what she had just confessed to. Marissa's face drained of all color. She abruptly ended the stream, plunging the pastel room into a tense, suffocating silence. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and quickly glanced at the screen. It was an urgent message from my lead attorney at Lawson Pike Legal. He had been actively monitoring her social media accounts specifically for this kind of foolish stunt. He had already screen recorded the entire live broadcast, securely capturing the file metadata, the precise timestamps, and the verbal confession. He informed me he was currently transmitting a formal spoliation of evidence notice to Marissa's management team, legally prohibiting them from deleting the archived video off their corporate servers. Gavin looked at Marissa. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might actually shatter. He looked at Elena, who was calmly writing down the exact minute the broadcast ended. Finally, he looked at me, and I saw the absolute, naked terror replacing his previously arrogant confidence. He grabbed Marissa by the arm, nearly dragging her out of the tasting room. He knocked over a tiered tray of delicate pastries in his blind haste, crushing pink spun sugar under his expensive leather shoes. I watched them retreat through the glass storefront, scrambling toward their leased luxury vehicle in a state of total, uncontrolled panic. I remained seated, taking a slow, refreshing sip of the sparkling water the baker had provided. The trap had not just snapped shut. The prey had practically locked themselves inside and handed me the only key. From this exact moment forward, Gavin was no longer operating with a clear, strategic head. He was backed into a legal corner, bleeding public credibility, and fighting a war on two completely different fronts. A desperate fraudster always makes careless mistakes, and I was perfectly positioned to capitalize on every single one of them. The final countdown to the sugar soirée was officially on, and the stage was flawlessly set for the grand finale. The final 72 hours before the event felt less like a waiting period and more like a synchronized military countdown. My encrypted inbox began lighting up with official confirmations, validating every single theory I had meticulously plotted on my whiteboard. The lead investigator from the title insurance underwriter was the first to formalize their findings. Their special investigations unit had forensically dismantled the origination file. They confirmed the employment verification from the phantom consulting firm was entirely fabricated. They traced the abnormal communication chain directly back to the intercepted mail at my childhood home. Most devastatingly, their tech division audited the remote online notarization logs and definitively proved the video session had been artificially spoofed. The notary seal was legally void, rendering the entire transaction a massive prosecutable fraud. The internal fraud unit of the mortgage lender did not hesitate. Recognizing a massive, unsecured financial liability, they moved in absolute silence, coordinating directly with the State Department of Financial Regulation. They were not sending squad cars to Gavin's office with flashing lights just yet. Instead, they executed a silent, administrative execution. They served an emergency suspension order on his broker license and froze all operational pipelines connected to his brokerage firm. Gavin was instantly paralyzed. He could not originate a new loan. He could not transfer funds out of escrow, and he could not tap into any corporate reserves to cover his rapidly expanding tracks. The financial oxygen was completely cut off, leaving him suffocating in the dark without a single public warning. Meanwhile, my attorney at Lawson Pike Legal delivered the most crucial weapon of the entire operation. It was a dense, heavily stamped document from the county court, a conditional temporary possession order, because I was the sole legal owner listed on the deed, and we had presented overwhelming preliminary evidence of occupancy fraud and identity theft. The judge granted immediate provisional rights of possession. The order contained a very specific, lethal caveat. If law enforcement arrived at the property and the current occupants could not produce a valid lease agreement or legitimate, non-fraudulent proof of ownership, the local sheriff was fully authorized to immediately intervene and secure the premises on my behalf. We did not want a messy, chaotic eviction on a random weekday morning. I wanted maximum visibility, zero escape routes, and absolute finality. My legal counsel orchestrated a precise multi-agency schedule. We coordinated with the civil division of the county sheriff, the lead investigator from the title insurer, and the corporate representative from the lender. They were instructed to stage their vehicles out of sight, just beyond the gated entrance of the Lake Norman neighborhood, and wait for my explicit signal. The target time was set for exactly the climax of the housewarming party, right when the massive live-stream charity auction was scheduled to begin. During the final planning call, I added one strict, non-negotiable requirement to the deployment strategy. I demanded that a private medical transport unit, complete with certified paramedics, be stationed alongside the deputies. My sister was 6 months pregnant. I knew the sheer, crushing weight of reality collapsing on her live broadcast was going to induce extreme panic. I wanted absolutely no accusations of reckless endangerment. This was a clinical, legally sanctioned repossession of stolen property, not an act of blind physical vengeance. The medical unit ensured that whatever theatrical, physical breakdown she attempted to use as a shield would be immediately and professionally managed by medical staff, keeping the liability entirely off my shoulders. As the hours ticked down to the day of the party, my phone began ringing incessantly. It was a relentless barrage from my parents. Elaine left 5 frantic voicemails, her voice trembling with a mixture of desperate pleading and familiar annoyance. Martin sent a dozen long text messages. They begged me to just wait until the weekend was over. They pleaded with me to let Marissa have her special day, citing the presence of high-profile guests, lucrative brand partners, and the delicate nature of our family honor. They promised we could sit down as a family on Monday morning and sort out the banking paperwork privately, without causing a public scene that would ruin her brand. I finally picked up the phone on the 20th ring. I did not yell. I did not cry. The anger had completely crystallized into something cold and unbreakable when my mother frantically begged me to think about our family honor. I stopped her with a single, softly spoken sentence. I told her that our family honor vanished the exact moment they allowed my stolen name to buy an $860,000 mansion for thieves. I ended the call and blocked both of their numbers permanently. There was no more negotiating with accomplices. Late that evening, just 12 hours before the party was set to begin, a sudden, urgent alert popped up on my secondary monitor. I had placed a continuous digital tripwire on the public database of the county recorder for any new filings attached to the property address. The tripwire had just been triggered. Gavin, desperate, completely cornered, and terrified by the frozen bank accounts, had attempted a profoundly stupid last-ditch maneuver. He had quietly submitted a quitclaim deed to the county clerk, attempting to rapidly transfer the legal title of the house from my name directly into the holding company of his fake transit consulting firm. To make it look legitimate, he had backdated the forged signature to 2 months prior. He thought he could move the asset out of my reach before the weekend. He had no idea the system of the county clerk was already heavily flagged by my temporary injunction. The fraudulent deed was instantly intercepted and rejected, but the digital submission receipt remained. He had just handed me documented, indisputable proof of an active, ongoing attempt to conceal stolen assets across state lines. He had dug his own grave 10 feet deeper. The morning of the event arrived. The sky was a vibrant, cloudless blue, the perfect backdrop for a pastel-themed influencer party. I stood in my bedroom, dressing with the meticulous care of an operative preparing for the final extraction. I chose a tailored, neutral-toned blazer and dark slacks, deliberately avoiding the requested pastel dress code. I walked into my home office and gathered the fruits of my labor: the certified court injunction, the conditional possession order, the undeniable proof of the fabricated corporate entity, the devastating furniture invoice bearing the forged signature of my sister, the fresh, rejected quitclaim deed Gavin had tried to file the night before. I did not put them in a standard manila folder. I walked into my kitchen, where a premium, round cardboard gift box sat on the counter. It was beautifully designed, painted in a soft blush pink, perfectly matching the theme of the sugar soirée. It was originally meant to hold a tower of delicate, imported French macarons. I opened the lid, removed the tissue paper, and carefully placed the thick stack of devastating legal documents inside. I secured the lid, tied it with a pristine silk ribbon, and picked it up. It was the only gift I was bringing to the dream house of my sister, and it was going to tear her fraudulent world apart. The Lake Norman estate had been entirely transformed into a temple of pastel extravagance. A massive balloon arch in shades of blush pink and mint green framed the custom mahogany front entrance. Inside, a towering champagne pyramid anchored the living room, while a live string quartet played soft pop covers in the corner. Marissa was holding court by the gutted and newly rebuilt imported marble kitchen island. She was heavily pregnant, draped in a flowing designer maternity gown, and glowing under the professional ring lights set up for her massive charity livestream. Our parents, Elaine and Martin, stood proudly beside her. They held crystal flutes and played the roles of wealthy, gracious hosts, acting as if they had not funded this entire glittering illusion by serving my identity on a silver platter to a criminal. I walked through the open double doors wearing a dark, sharply tailored suit, a stark and deliberate contrast to the sea of pastel cocktail dresses. I carried absolutely nothing but the round, blush-pink macaron gift box. The room quieted slightly as I navigated through the crowd and approached the dessert table. Marissa caught sight of me. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine panic, but the glowing red recording light on her streaming camera forced her to maintain the aesthetic facade. She offered a wide, entirely synthetic smile to her thousands of viewers and announced loudly that her estranged sister had finally shown up to congratulate her on her beautiful new dream home. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice, nor did I engage in the manufactured, emotional sisterly drama she desperately wanted for her engagement metrics. I simply placed the pink box directly onto the marble counter, right in front of her camera lens, and quietly insisted she open her gift live for her massive digital audience. Marissa, sensing what she assumed would be a viral, heartwarming moment, untied the pristine silk ribbon and pulled off the lid. There were no French pastries inside. Instead, a thick, heavy stack of legal files spilled out onto the countertop. The bold, black letters of the court-ordered injunction, the federal fraud dispute notices, and the undeniable copies of the forged origination documents were entirely visible in high definition. Gavin lunged forward. He dropped his drink, his face twisting in sudden terror, and desperately tried to scoop the papers back into the box. He turned to the crowd, laughing nervously, attempting to spin the terrifying reality into a petty family misunderstanding. He claimed I was just causing a dramatic scene over a minor paperwork error. Right as the words left his mouth, the heavy oak front doors swung open again. The cavalry had arrived exactly on schedule. A uniformed deputy from the county civil division stepped into the foyer, his hand resting calmly on his tactical belt. He was flanked by the lead corporate investigator from the title insurance company and a senior representative from the State Financial Licensing Board. The music stopped abruptly. The chatter died. Before the stunned guests and the actively rolling camera, the takedown commenced with ruthless, administrative precision. The lender investigator stepped forward and confirmed loudly that the $860,000 mortgage attached to the property was officially locked down under a federal criminal inquiry for identity theft and occupancy fraud. The state representative immediately served Gavin with a formal, binding notice of suspension, stripping him of his broker license and freezing his entire corporate operation effectively immediately. Finally, the uniformed deputy announced he was executing a conditional possession order on behalf of the sole legal owner of the property, Avery Lewis. Gavin stood entirely paralyzed, but the legal barrage was not over. The state investigator pulled a digital receipt from his folder. He looked Gavin dead in the eye and informed him that the county recorder had flagged his desperate attempt to file a forged, backdated quitclaim deed the previous night. By attempting to transfer stolen assets across state lines to a phantom corporate entity, Gavin had officially elevated his situation from a localized wire fraud dispute into a multi-tiered federal racketeering charge. Gavin physically collapsed against the kitchen island, the color draining entirely from his face as he realized he had buried himself. Elaine and Martin rushed forward, breaking their frozen shock. They tried to intervene, loudly demanding the officers leave their successful son-in-law alone and threatening to call their own high-priced defense attorney. I reached into the scattered pile of evidence on the counter and handed my father the high-resolution copy of the cross-collateralization agreement they had blindly signed days prior. I explained, with absolute, unshakable calm, that the state regulatory agencies were moving to seize all financial assets tied to Gavin's fraudulent portfolio, because they had willingly signed a liquidity guarantee for his shadow loans. Their beloved mountain retirement cabin was now legally bound to his sinking ship. The realization hit my father like a physical blow. He dropped his glass. It shattered into dozens of pieces on the hardwood floor. But neither of my parents moved. They stood dead silent, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic price of their own blind favoritism. Marissa backed away from Gavin, sobbing hysterically. She looked directly into her still-rolling camera and screamed that she was an innocent victim, that she had absolutely no idea the house was stolen, and that her husband had lied to her about everything. I stepped forward and dropped the final piece of paper onto the marble counter. It was the $22,500 invoice from the European Luxury Furniture Atelier. I pointed to the signature line, bearing her exact handwriting, ordering a velvet sectional under the name Avery Lewis. I looked at her and stated clearly that innocent victims do not forge the signatures of their siblings to bypass credit checks and buy imported chandeliers. Her primary defense crumbled instantly in front of her entire audience. Her digital brand was incinerated in real time. The deputy stepped in, noting the presence of the 2 certified paramedics waiting by the front door. He informed Marissa she had exactly 60 minutes to pack her essential personal belongings and vacate the premises safely. There was no screaming match, no physical violence, and absolutely no danger allowed near her unborn child. It was simply the cold, mechanical reality of the law removing a trespasser from stolen property. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Gavin was indicted on multiple federal charges and ultimately accepted a harsh plea deal to avoid a 20-year prison sentence. Marissa lost the waterfront estate. Her lucrative brand sponsorships vanished overnight, and she was forced to file for personal bankruptcy, living in a cramped apartment far away from her former wealthy aesthetic. Elaine and Martin lost their retirement cabin to the bank, their golden years entirely decimated by the man they chose to protect over me. As for me, my forensic dossier completely cleared my name. My credit score was fully restored. Blackridge Integrity Analytics not only reinstated my security clearance but promoted me to a senior directorship position for handling an active, multi-million-dollar fraud crisis with unparalleled precision. I eventually sold the Lake Norman property through the proper legal channels, using the newly cleared equity to quietly purchase a beautiful, secluded home of my own. The absolute sweetest sugar revenge was never going to be a screaming match or a physical fight. It was the profound, unshakable peace of watching everything return to its rightful name, the proper law, and the exact, devastating price of their betrayal. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments so we can interact and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.